English translation, 231st contact. Thursday, 9th of November, 1989, 09:48 hours.
Today I bring you a joyful message, namely that it is now really time for Ptah to visit you again in such a wise that you may speak openly about it. What was true until now, that you were not allowed to talk about the contacts with him, Taljda, Plaja, Manara, Asket, Zetlan, and all the others, and the conversations held with them for security reasons, and were not allowed to record anything about them in writing, because their information, which they gave you throughout the past years, was not allowed to be disclosed to the group members or to the public. Now it will be different again. From now on, you will also be allowed to write down the contact conversations with Ptah and all others again. So Ptah will continue to come to you in order to officially continue the contacts with you again, as I already told you in March. This was not planned, because Asket and some of her friends should have officially taken over this task. For health reasons on your part, this was changed, so Ptah will now officially be your most important contact person. Of course, several others will endeavor to get in touch with you, but Ptah will remain the main contact person. You can also write down the contact conversations between you and him again, as well as the conversations with all others, as I already explained. However, certain issues must continue to be officially concealed from your side with regard to security reasons, etc. The contact conversations that you have had with Ptah, Asket, and all others in all the past years are probably registered word for word with us, but they must remain unpublished to the group members and the earthly public, which Ptah already explained to you at the beginning of his visits and conversations, whereby he also gave you the reason for it. The only exceptions are the conversations between you and me. All the unofficial visits of all the others during the years when I had the official contact talks with you are now finally over, so they will be official again. The first meeting between Ptah and you will probably take place in a week, but Ptah will inform you telepathically about the exact date.
So everything will have an official form again with Ptah and all the others. But what about the contacts with Asket, Takara, the Preserver, Shukana, the Crystal Collector, and Tashkima, the Unfathomable? I mean, if all conversations have to remain unofficial as before. The contacts ended on the 23rd of September and will not be continued, because the purpose was fulfilled, as they explained to me.
That is of correctness. The purpose of the impulse help is fulfilled, and the necessary changes in those group members have resulted for whom the impulse help was intended.
Can we perhaps now officially say why Asket and her friends gave these impulse aids? If so, please explain it now.
Now that everything has come about in the group members concerned, except your wife, with regard to the necessary transformation, you can speak openly about the fact that everything has occurred so, because it had to be so for your health's sake, because you would not have survived the quarrels of certain responsible group members and the evils arising from it. That was the reason for the help impulses for certain faulty group members, whereby these could change their personality and character misconduct and promote it for the better. If they had not received this impulse help from Asket and her colleagues, there would have been no changes in the wrongdoers, which would have continued to burden your health severely. A second final and irreparable health breakdown would have been the result, whereby you would not have been able to fulfill the mission. It is true that our last ultimatums have already brought about some welcome changes in the members of the group, but it was not enough to be able to take everything even further with regard to the mission and lead it to actual success. So the High Council decided on the unofficial help via Asket, about which you had to be silent in order not to create any influence on the guilty group members. The help impulses were such throughout the time that they did not cause any compulsion, which is why each group member could freely take them in and use them, which finally led to the necessary change in the consciousness-based and character area. However, only the greatest evils to save your life and the mission were resolved, while various other things exist in the group members that require transformation. Since in all the years that have passed since the 9th of November 1984, the greatest evils have been remedied by Askets and their collaborators' help impulses in the guilty group members. The best prospect now is that further necessary changes will be brought about independently. This will further improve everything, resulting in more and more successes in expanding the mission. Of course, relapses in the behavior of certain group members will be unavoidable, although sometimes quite harsh things will appear, but they should also be manageable and become increasingly rare. Our advice is to be lenient in such cases, even if a relapse is ausartened, to do with getting very badly out of control of the good human nature. Especially with certain founding members, sufficient indulgence should be shown in this regard, even if hard measures have to be taken. It should always be borne in mind that everyone has the right to reflect and change, even if it takes a long time. When I think of the things that appeared in the early years with the group members, which we ourselves were not able to cope with in the right wise, because everything was unusual and unknown to us, then I have to say that in the course of time, everything has changed for the better. As I said, by no means everything is such that it could be regarded as relatively perfect. But we can speak with a clear conscience of a very great improvement and transformation, which can be calculated at 67% of the original. That is a lot, but we have to admit that this result would never have come about without your expert guidance of the group members. You have an exceptionally good and loving way of treating and leading people, and indeed, always according to how it should be. So you can not only be very explanatory in all things, but also loving and empathetic as well as advising and helping people, but if necessary, you can also raise your powerful voice loudly and powerfully when the situation requires it. You are also able to give relevant instructions and hints with regard to work. But you can also do the work yourself or demonstrate it in practice, because you are used to doing manual work in many areas and have learned a lot. And what I would like to emphasize in all this is your almost endless patience, which you show to people in all things, but which, unfortunately, is often to your detriment, because your patience is often maliciously and deceitfully exploited. There.
Sorry, my friend, that really should be enough. My only request was that you explain the circumstances of the unofficial contacts of Askets regarding the help impulses. So please leave the arias concerning my person, because what is said is already more than abundant and praiseworthy, and I can do without that. So I would rather you would answer some questions, like what you meant when you said that after the turn of the millennium the American President Bush Jr. and the English Prime Minister, whom you called Blair after the war in Iraq, which they will deliberately trigger, want to pull themselves out of the loop. Unfortunately, I forgot to ask you further about it.
Bush Jr. and Blair will conspire together against Iraq, whereby Bush wants to avenge his father's defeat in the Gulf War by a new war against Saddam Hussein, as has already been secretly decided by both Bushes and their closest followers, including the highest authorities of the CIA. If the war started in 1991, will not bring the desired success. The lie that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction and can attack the world within a few hours or days will be deliberately stirred up and spread by all those responsible. This conscious and infamous lie will deceive not only the American and British people, but the rest of the world as well, and will lead various leaders of various states to join in the lies of Bush and Blair and participate in the Second Gulf War triggered by the United States in 2003. It will be a war that will become a disaster, but only after the actual acts of war, through the emergence of terrorism by suicide bombers who will rise up against the American and British occupation, and against all those Iraqis who cooperate with the Americans and the British or who are simply friendly with them. Thus, there will be many more deaths among the occupying forces than the whole war itself will demand. Iraqis themselves, men, women, and children, will also lose their lives by the dozen through suicide attacks, and a very high death rate will result. And since, after the first Gulf War triggered by the USA, the actual dangerous weapons, such as rockets and weapons of mass destruction, are destroyed by Saddam Hussein or simply put out of action, there will be no such weapons at the turn of the millennium, as I explained to you earlier. As a result, the Americans and the English will no longer be able to find such weapons. But this will not interest the American Secret Service CIA anymore, nor George W. Bush Jr., who wants to finish his father's work, nor Tony Blair, who will be wrapped up by Bush. Contrary to better knowledge, they will make everything up and invent lies in order to be able to set out against Saddam Hussein. But if no weapons of mass destruction, etc., are found even after the war and during the occupation period, then the criminally responsible persons, Bush, Blair, as well as those of the American Secret Service CIA, will come to the public with a new lying claim that they were wrong. They will claim through a well-considered lie that they could not have known that Saddam Hussein had no more dangerous weapons, and especially no more weapons of mass destruction. But as I said, this will be a well-thought-out lie, to minimize everything and to deceive the country's population and the rest of the world once again.
Aha, that is what you meant. But what about other predictions? Did you ask Ptah if you could mention anything else?
His opinion is that I can probably still explain some things, even if it will certainly not bear much fruit, because the Earth humans will not listen to it.
That will certainly be so. But nevertheless, we should talk about it. Because one or the other human may learn something for themselves personally. We can also certainly talk about the past, because I have another question concerning the faked moon landing with Apollo 11 on the 20th of July, 1969. Allegedly, the American Neil Alden Armstrong landed on the moon together with E. Aldrin, whereby Armstrong is said to have set his feet on the moon floor first. The lunar ferry was said to be the Eagle, and the landing site the Sea of Calm. A good name, because there was no landing at that time. Maybe later some real manned or unmanned moon landings took place, which were unofficial, whereby perhaps also the moon vehicle was abandoned, how also other and footprints were made, who knows. The program ended with Apollo 17. At the alleged landing on the 20th of July, 1969, Michael Collins was the helmsman of the command capsule. We have already talked about this story several times, and you, Simyase, as well as you and Ptah, have explained that practically everyone involved in this deception was hypnotized by experts, and the whole moon landing with all its trimmings was made out to them by a deep hypnosis. Nevertheless, it was not said to have worked extensively for all of them, and those who did not were then carried out of life by accident or illness. Now the question has arisen whether Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins also got the moon landing experience hammered into them by hypnosis, and whether the three of them really had no idea about it.
In fact, that is what it was. The three were subjected to such a deep hypnosis that no doubts or inconsistencies appeared in them, so their hypnotic intrigue was perfect.
Thank you, I thought to myself, because the three men were firmly convinced of their alleged moon landing. But the hypnotists, did they really keep their mouths shut?
That they remained silent for all times was taken care of, because all four were killed by accidents.
Aha, had to be well because they were not hypnotized, I think.
That is of correctness.
Then I have other questions. But first I want to know what can be done about multiple sclerosis, what triggers it, how it can be prevented or alleviated. After that I was asked what I, as a layman, did not know how to answer, of course, or how vitamin D works and how it works.
Multiple sclerosis is mainly caused by a failure of the immune system. It is an inflammatory disease of the central nervous system, resulting in a heart-shaped demyelination and, to a lesser extent, damage to the axis cylinders. In its entirety, it is an autoimmune disease against myelin antigens. The origin can be genetically determined, but it can also be traced back to various environmental influences and viruses, as well as other bacterial pathogens, which must be determined on a case-by-case basis. Pets such as cats and dogs, etc., can also transmit certain pathogens to humans, causing multiple sclerosis. Particularly at risk are people who suffer from vitamin D deficiency, because the immune system is severely impaired and in certain parts completely rendered inoperative, which can cause the disease to gain a foothold and become acute. It would go too far to discuss vitamin D in its entirety and in and of itself. You should look this up in a reference book.
Then a moment. Yes, here. Wait a minute. This is the Roche Dictionary of Medicine. Something could be described in short form. Here, yes, there is something. It says the following: vitamin D, calciferol, anti-rachite. Factor, collective term, D group, for fat-soluble, photosensible sterile derivatives. In particular, vitamins D2 and D3 ergo or cholecalciferol, motrofone, calciol or calciol, as well as their natural provitamins, the ergosterol and the vitamin D3. 7-dehydrocholesterol, from which they develop in the skin under UV exposure. In the liver, 25-hydroxycholecalciferol, calcidiol, and in the kidney, 1,25-dihydroxycholecalciferol. Calcitriol, the most effective metabolite, is formed. Storage takes place in the body. Daily requirement 2 to 10 micrograms. In case of overdose, dehypervitaminosis, poisoning symptoms, K-mobilization with hypercalcemia and urea, hypophosphatemia and nephrocalcinosis. Furthermore, hyperazotemia, citrate increase, reduction of alkaline levels. Phosphatase, loss of appetite, vomiting, constipation, possibly dystrophy, intensive calcification of the epiphyses. Therapy, discontinuation of D-medication, calcium and milk-free diet, cortisone as D antagonist. Natural occurrence of D3 in animals. Tissues, liver oils of all fish, chicken eggs, milk, butter. The intestinal precursors are subject to normal fat absorption. Deficiency leads to mineralization disorders, in infants and small children to rickets, in adults to osteomalacia and ESEC. Hyperparathyroidism, a constitutional D. Hypersensitivity with D hypervitaminosis symptoms becomes manifest mainly in immobilization, slowed growth and dystrophy, rarely also as a family syndrome due to insufficient hepatitis. D inactivation steroid degradation disorder. Units 1 EU 0.025 microgram vit. D2 or D3 international reference sample, YARS 1 USP. 1 Madai 2 or D3, 4,000 IU, 1 Madaicher, 2,000 to 3,000 IU, 1 clinical reference sample, 1 clinical reference sample, 1 clinical reference sample, 1 clinical reference sample. 15 prophylactic. E 0.38 IU, 1 protection unit, Shareware 0.125 IU, 1 protection unit dose S, ED, Shimura 0.5 IU, E vitamin D, anti-rachitic VIT. Vitamin D binding protein, DBP, see below. GC groups, a vitamin D binding protein. So far the text. IU stands for International Unit. Written comprehensibly, but certainly not for those people who are not familiar with these things.
That is correct, because what you are reading is a medical jargon. However, the description is good so far, only very incomplete, which, however, does not detract from what is expressed.
So we should be content with that and turn back to other things. I am still not clear about the lightning we talked about some time ago. You said that on the one hand airplanes and rockets produce so-called catching flashes, and on the other hand that humans and animals can die from cardiac arrest due to lightning, although they are not directly struck by flashes, but only by magnetic oscillations emanating from flashes.
This is of correctness. As I explained to you earlier, lightning occurs in thunderclouds, coming out of the clouds both upwards and downwards and sideways. The lightning that descends to the earth seeks its way in the last 30 to 100 meters above the ground in differently polarized lightning forms that emanate from the earth, usually from elevations such as towers, houses, trees, mountains, humans and animals as well as ships, etc. The lightning coming out of the thunderclouds combine purely by coincidence with the lightning coming out from the earth and go up, in order to then descend with tremendous gavolt to the earth or to the objects from which the earth lightning comes, that is to say towers, ships, humans, animals, vehicles, and etc. Each lightning strike creates a very far-reaching magnetic tension, which is so strong that it can cause a cardiac arrest in humans and animals far away from the actual lightning strike. This happens in a moment between two heartbeats, because the heart is most susceptible to magnetic oscillations, which, when they occur, lead to immediate cardiac arrest. For example, one may be struck directly by lightning and suffer severe burns, etc., but survives, while another, who is away and not struck by lightning, may die from cardiac arrest because it is struck by the swinging waves of the magnetic field of the lightning. This can also be true in so-called dry thunderstorms, also known as silent thunderstorms. These are electrical discharges that take place in clouds without a visible thunderstorm appearing. But there is lightning as well as thunder, which is also called atmospheric shooting, as well as the other atmospheric bangs, which can be heard especially in the silence of the night high in the sky and sound as if plugs under high pressure would jump off. As you know, there is also lightning from bright and blue skies, or from the night sky and starry skies, without any clouds to be seen. Such flashes are also very dangerous, but they usually, with exceptions, do not occur in cloudless skies, but far away, miles away. Sunshine, a blue night sky, or a starry night sky can all be sunshine, and suddenly a thunderless lightning strikes a tree, a person, an animal, a house, a tower, or a vehicle, and can even be fatal. But the origin of the lightning can be a thundercloud, 15 or 30 kilometers away, or simply hidden behind a mountain. And with regard to airplanes, rockets, and other missiles, when they move in the atmosphere, especially when they fly through thunderstorm zones, they produce so-called catching flashes, which can also be described as catching charges. The flying body serves as a pole of attraction for the electrical energy of the lightning, which manifests itself visibly on the flying body, whereby the electrical and electronic apparatuses are damaged or at least temporarily put out of operation, which in the worst case can lead to the crash of the flying body.
Not very pleasant, but thank you very much for your explanation. Then I have two questions about color blindness, because I talked to Engelbert about it. He is interested in knowing what is the origin or reason for color blindness. Firstly, not only humans but also animals can be colorblind. And secondly, what is the reason for color blindness? Do you know about it as a doctor?
Not only humans but also animals can be affected by color blindness caused by a lack of calcium in the eyes.
The explanation is that simple. I would not have thought so.
It is only simple when you know it.
Which, of course, you are right about again. About 65 million years ago, the Great Catastrophe, in which dinosaurs and many other large animals were exterminated, was an approximately 11,000-meter-large world space projectile that hit the Earth. Is it really true that only this meteor was to blame for everything?
Basically, yes, at least in the origin, because from this there were other bad consequences, which led to the final catastrophe. Due to the tremendous impact, enormous vibrations were caused on the whole planet, which were triggered by a chain reaction of worldwide earthquakes, as a result of which 314 large volcanoes erupted almost simultaneously within a few hours, followed by 608 further heavy eruptions in a few days. The meteor and the volcanic eruptions spewed so much dust, ash, and steam, as well as poisonous gases and other substances, into the atmosphere that most of the larger life on the Earth suffocated or perished, whereby the solar radiation did not penetrate to the Earth's surface. These are other things that we have researched by looking back.
That is enough, thank you. Another thing, you once explained that thoughts and feelings as well as the environment, such as ecological factors, environmental conditions, etc., influence the genes of all life forms and cause changes that are inherited. But now I no longer know in which context you gave this explanation.
The talk was about the fact that the life forms are able to adapt to the environmental conditions by the changes of the genes.
Right, that was it. But tell me, would you answer a question for a doctor I know?
If it does not violate our directives?
I do not think so. The question is there a drug for Alzheimer's disease?
We are aware of such active substances, yes.
Can you name them to me?
That would be contrary to our directives.
And if you only give me a remedy that at least counteracts forgetfulness, even in Alzheimer's?
That would be justifiable, because such a remedy will be synthetically created by earthly scientists in the next few years.
Then let us hear it, please.
A suitable active substance can be obtained from the flower plant, Galanthus nivalis. This active substance is an anti-dementia agent and works against speech disorders and behavioral disorders, as well as memory disorders and memory loss. The active substance to be obtained is galantamine, which is to a certain extent also effective against Alzheimer's dementia.
Galanthus nivalis. The name seems familiar to me. Is that not the Latin name for the common snowdrop? Somehow I remember this name from school when I learned various Latin flower names with teacher Gustav Lehmann.
Your memory is good.
Usually medical agents also have side effects. Is that also the case with the galantium you mentioned? What did you call it?
Galantamine, not galantium. Yes, if the drug is misused or overdosed, it causes delusions, anxiety, euphoria, insomnia, restlessness, etc.
Hallucinations?
Also,
And do we already know the material?
the plant and its active ingredient were already known to the ancient Greeks as well as the ancient Persians, the early Ottomans and their predecessors, but also to the Caucasians, where the plant Galanthus nivalis was originally native. Even then, The plant and its active ingredient were used by local folk medicine for the treatment of brain weakness and dementia. Especially in elderly people, the remedy was used to stimulate brain activity. The active substance galantamine was rediscovered on the earth at the end of the 50s when it was extracted from tubers or bulbs of the Caucasian Galanthus nivalis plant by a very complex purification process. However, the substance will only be synthetically produced in the next decade, as a review of the future has shown, and it will then also be discovered that the active substance galantamine is also suitable for the treatment of Alzheimer's dementia, but will not be approved for treatment until after the turn of the millennium. Technically speaking, it will be an anti-dementia drug, that is to say, a drug against brain weakness. However, it is not an actual remedy, but only an active substance that will have a slowing effect on the course of the disease, and that only in the case of moderate and mild symptoms.
And what is the origin of the disease?
There are several factors. The disease is a degenerative disease of the cerebral cortex, with characteristic neuropathological and neurochemical changes and inexorably progressive dementia. First signs are a high degree of forgetfulness and aphasia. The causes include metabolic disorders and, above all, genetic factors, as well as a conscious inertia and a deficiency of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Overall, a loss of brain cells in the forebrain occurs.
Everything unpleasant. But if we are already with such things, homosexuality, which is genetically caused and therefore has a biological cause, which will be denied by our scientists for a long time to come, as you once mentioned. Can you briefly say something about that? I mean, homosexuality. It is not supposed to be a scientific treatise.
You have actually already mentioned the decisive facts. I just want to add them, that humans as well as animals prefer same-sex partners founded in a genetic inclination. Consequently, the sexual preference has a biological cause, as you said. The hypothalamus is the decisive factor here, because it controls sexual behavior. In lesbian women and homosexual men, as well as in similar animals, a very special accumulation of nerve cells in the hypothalamus is greatly reduced, resulting in a tendency to sexual homosexuality. More is actually not to be explained about it.
But the hypothalamus also controls blood pressure and body temperature, does it not?
That is of correctness.
Can you tell me something about the main factors that cause heartburn? You also once said that this evil can cause asthma, and that excess stomach acid is not always the cause of pain.
Asthma is correct, as is excess stomach acid, which is not always the cause of pain. For many people, wrong eating habits and stress lead to heartburn. Often a strong pressure on the stomach is the cause of the pain, or there is a malfunction of the valve between stomach and esophagus. An unhealthy diet is just as much a factor in the production of heartburn as a hectic lifestyle and obesity. Alcohol and smoking are also heartburn promoters, as are lavish or fatty foods. Too much coffee as well as various teas, such as peppermint, also as sugar confectionery, etc., promote heartburn. Smoking products paralyze the lower part of the esophagus, causing the stomach-esophagus valve to malfunction and thus resulting in heartburn.
Are there any natural remedies that really help?
Of course, the best of which is probably raw potato juice, 1 tablespoonful of which is enough to dispel the symptoms. Nettle tea can also be effective.
What should be considered to prevent heartburn?
Eating opulently and greasy as well as in excess should be avoided, as well as smoking and stress. When eating, you should take care that only small meals are taken, whereby peppermint as well as chocolate and too many carbohydrates should be renounced. to which various lemonade drinks with a lot of sugar belong, as well as sour fruit juices, etc. After a meal, you should take a break and not work again immediately or do sports. It is also important not to wear tight clothing that puts pressure on the body and especially on the stomach. Meals should be moderate, light, and balanced, especially in the evening, whereby bed rest should not be considered immediately after the meal. The last meal should be taken 3 to 4 hours before going to bed, otherwise alpine pressure may occur, in addition to heartburn.
Aha! The life on the Earth originated from the fact that on the one hand comets, molecular clouds and meteors, etc. inseminated the Earth from outer space, while on the other hand, also the Earth developed molecules. Can you tell me, since you are a geologist, biologist, chemist, and physicist, etc., when the first living molecules appeared on our Earth?
What corresponds to our research in this area is that the first non-thermal living molecules already existed on the Earth about 4.2 billion 4,200,000 years ago.
There are still many questions on this piece of paper. Genetic engineering, as we have often talked about, when will it take on greater proportions? You also said that resistances will emerge and unreasonable ones will cry against it. But in the end, even these lunatics will have to give in and will not be able to stop the genetic engineering process. These adversaries are said to be all unreasonable ones who do not understand anything and are afraid of getting their pants full, because they think that genetic engineering only produces evil for humans, especially through genetically modified food. The progress inhibitors, these crazy anti-genetic technology criers, will probably prevent us from making really good progress in food, medicine, and so on for some time in the future.
This will unfortunately be the case, even after the turn of the millennium, because the fools, the anxious, the negative ones, and all other antagonists are unfortunately incited by irresponsible and self-opinionated ones, as well as unreasonable and stupid know-it-alls, as is the case with many progressive instances. The great turning point towards valuable and beneficial genetic engineering for terrestrial humans will only come in the new millennium.
The state of low intelligence does not just die out, especially not in terrestrial humans. But another question concerning health. Is there a natural method to reduce the risk of cardiovascular diseases?
Certainly, such a remedy is provided by the cocoa bean. These are very effective flavonoids.
Then cocoa drinks and chocolate would actually be healthy, except for those who have problems with heartburn.
That is of correctness. However, cocoa drinks and chocolate should not contain milk.
Then only water, cocoa, and dark chocolate would be the best choice.
That is also of correctness.
Good. We once talked about the fact that the same forms of physics and chemistry, etc., apply in the entire universe. And we also talked about the fact that there are 280 basic elements, which Guido came across in the end, because he is very concerned with these things. Our earthly scientists do not know all the elements, nor do they know that there are many other isotope compositions outside of the Earth than what is known about chemical compounds on the Earth. Thus, for example, many extraterrestrial chemical compounds are also different for hydrogen, nitrogen, and carbon atoms than for us on the Earth. Nevertheless, the physical and chemical laws, etc., known on the Earth, which prevail on the Earth, also apply in space and on foreign worlds and stars, as well as in nebulae and clouds in the universe. But beyond the Earth, there is much more in relation to everything. Because on the Earth, not everything can be found that is given universe-wide in relation to chemistry and physics, etc. One has to keep in mind that earthly scientists know only a little more than a third of all 280 elements. Now to the short question. May Guido and I officially talk about these facts?
Nothing speaks against that. Guido can also take up and explain these concerns in his books. which he will write in the course of the next years and in the new millennium. However, he must be very careful about his health, because it will cause him great problems in the future. Caution must be his motto so that he can finish his works.
Your word in his ear. But now I want to come up with something that I think is important for all Earth humans to know. Children are not only the offspring, but also the effective future of humankind. Besides, the human being is equipped to pass on their genes. But what I want to say, for many humans it is a fantasy to construct children according to their own ideas. This dream has been haunting the minds of the human beings on the Earth for a long time, and for about 10, 30 or more years there has been research and attempts to create offspring artificially, using a variety of methods ranging from artificial insemination to cloning and even artificial life that is to be grown from human stem cells and will one day actually be, as I know from Ta and you. Even Svath talked to me about it when I was 12 years old. And now, for about 10 years, artificial insemination has been carried out on women by fertilizing eggs in a test tube and then inserting them into the uterus. Can you explain a little more about this artificial insemination? Because Svath already said that this is an unfortunate method that causes a lot of disaster. Our doctors and researchers are still very ignorant, even in relation to the real processes in the woman's ovaries, as you recently said.
Constructing a child according to one's own imaginings, as you correctly express it, is actually a fantasy for many people, which is taken up again and again and from now on, and which will come into the limelight very much in the future, especially because women will deliver and bear children, although they will have had the menopause behind them for years. So the science of artificial insemination is becoming more and more talked about. And as you rightly said, for more than 30 years, there have been many experiments in laboratories around the world in the field of cloning and artificial insemination, which has long triggered oppressive thoughts and feelings in many human beings who know about it. In the coming years, and especially at the turn of the millennium and in the new millennium, this will become even more pronounced. It is already an established fact that so-called test tube babies have been born for about 10 years. But these were only the first steps to the so-called imagined child or designer child. Because from now on, there are more and more experiments in this respect worldwide, whereby also irresponsible scientists will make themselves famous by artificial inseminations of the mentioned kind. The earthly physicians and researchers also still face many puzzles which they have to solve, because they still live in great ignorance, as for example also in the assumption that the ovaries of female suckling life forms, also of the human female sex, come into the world with a certain number of immature ova, from which mature ova would be produced when the sexual maturity of the life form is given. They do not yet know that this thesis is completely wrong, because new ova are formed again and again, while a certain part of the old ova dissolve. In the next decade and in the new millennium, everything concerning artificial insemination will intensify to such an extent that it will become routine. Although many factors will not be taken into account and will be unknown to scientists in the relationship that artificial insemination will cause many evils to appear for the offspring thus conceived. In the near future, however, test tube babies will be conceived artificially in large numbers, which will also help childless couples or individual women to have their own offspring. But this is not the ultimate way to solve the offspring problem, because the whole thing has many aspects that should be considered critically and responsibly. A healthy and at the same time beautiful and intelligent child is probably the wish of all parents or single women who wish to have a child. However, this wish cannot always be fulfilled in the normal way for a variety of reasons, especially if there is infertility on the part of the woman or man. And if such a wish for children cannot be fulfilled, then it is assumed that artificial insemination is an alternative that will soon become routine in the near future. The unjustified pride of scientists will be very great, and what really started about 10 years ago with artificial insemination will lead over the next 15 years to over 1 million test tube babies being conceived and born. Although artificial insemination has been very successful, this method will never be without its problems, because test tube insemination is very dangerous, because there are enormous risks of physical and consciousness-based malformations. Heart defects and cleft palate defects, as well as deformities and defects of the kidneys, can also be present, as well as disturbances of consciousness. Schizophrenia, cerebral damage, thought and feeling disorders, and thus psychological suffering, in addition to Mongolism-Downs syndrome, certain forms of cancer, and a chronic immune deficiency. The causes are based on the beginning of pregnancy. The whole process begins with the egg cell. During normal fertilization by sexual intercourse, millions of sperm go on the way to fertilizing the egg, whereby, ultimately, only a few strong ones actually reach the egg, because in fact only the healthiest and strongest reach the goal. Finally, as a rule, only a single sperm succeeds in penetrating the egg and fertilizing it. Within the egg, the genetic material of both parents then merges into a genetic material arrangement. This is completely in contrast to the beginning of the life of a retort fertilization, in which the beginning of the life begins under completely different conditions. The woman, the mother, must first undergo a longer daily therapy with the injection of hormones. However, this method and treatment is not harmless, as there is always a high health risk. The hormones injected stimulate the woman's ovaries in such a manner that several ova mature simultaneously. This is in contrast to the completely natural conditions in which only a single egg matures. Once the eggs have matured during artificial egg maturation, they are removed with a cannula, which is usually a rather painful procedure. The best ova are then sorted out, and everything goes satisfactorily. Then the sperm are added after an appropriate preparation. If a sperm penetrates or is introduced into the egg and fertilizes it, artificial insemination is successful. Often more than one egg cell is fertilized in this wise, after which embryos develop within 30 hours. The introduction of several fertilized eggs into the woman's uterus increases the possibility of pregnancy. Here, too, there is a risk that unwanted multiple births may result, which is not uncommon. However, this in turn leads to further risks, because very often such children become premature births, which can lead to associated serious complications, such as developmental disorders and mild and severe neurological defects. However, the greatest risk does not lie with the preterm birth itself, but with another factor. In natural pregnancy, the egg cell passes through the fallopian tube after natural ovulation, where fertilization also takes place. As the egg continues to move through the fallopian tube, it passes through an environment which is very important for the further development of the egg, and which provides the necessary impulses, aids and signals which are important both for the pregnancy itself and later also for full development and birth. However, this very important process is not achieved by fertilization in the test tube. And this is precisely the unsolvable problem, because the lack of a passage through the fallopian tube leads to malformations. Genes are switched on incorrectly, just as others are switched off incorrectly, including growth genes that are misdirected. This causes children to become overweight at an early age, which can persist into old age. In many cases, enlarged internal organs appear, which can degenerate irreparably. Particularly inferior sperm carrying defective genes that are introduced into the ova lead to severe physical, psychological, and consciousness-based malformations. In addition, when the sperm are introduced into the eggs, their spindle system, which is responsible for the separation of the chromosomes, is damaged. This, in turn, is another factor in the risks that can lead to all sorts of malformations, diseases, immunodeficiencies, sexual deformities, etc. This is what I would like to have explained.
Thank you, that is enough. Earlier, I also talked about stem cells, which Ta and I talked about on my great journey. Svath also explained to me some things about it, also in relation to the fact that Hennek had produced his peoples in the earliest times by creating ova and sperm from stem cells, which he brought together in an artificially created fallopian tube, and which then settled in an artificially created uterus and an artificially created womb and grew into viable embryos and babies who were then also born. These babies grew up to adults, were completely healthy and procreative, so that they could reproduce themselves further in a normal way. Svath and Ptah also explained to me that you also use stem cells to grow organs to transplant them in humans if necessary. Now the question arises, when will it be so far on the Earth that scientists will be able to create artificial ova, sperm, uteruses, and individual organs with stem cells?
For quite some time now, scientific laboratories around the world have been carrying out research in this field, which will make a lot of noise in the coming years, and especially after the turn of the millennium. The process is just as unstoppable as cloning technology and genetic engineering in all areas. But what I can explain in a simplified manner is the following. On the way to made to measure means by humans, the boundary must be crossed that leads from the simple procreation between the feminine and the masculine to the actual creational, which lies absolutely within the framework of the human possible and in the normal human evolution. No laws of creation are violated, but are fulfilled in the opposite way. The form of procreation by stem cells is an advance in which the barrier must be overcome before the time of birth, and in which an artificial uterus must also be produced by stem cells. Such a barrier can also be the solution for premature babies who are still kept alive on the earth in so-called incubators. Stem cell technology is the foundation of the fact from which the distant future of earthly humankind will change. In the far future, embryonic stem cells will be obtained, which will result in major changes. The stem cells are obtained by dividing a fertilized egg cell and forming a cell ball after a few days. This egg sphere contains the stem cells from which any cell type of the body can develop. These cells can later be used to replace diseased cells and tissues in the body. Through the embryonic stem cells, all organs of the body can also be cultivated in the laboratory, as well as male germ cells, that is to say, sperm and female ova, as well as uteruses and even a womb with all functions to bring about offspring when the sperm produced fertilize the ova and become embryos and babies. The womb, which has grown out of embryonic stem cells and has its own uterus, does not form into a finished and final female, but lives and exists through life impulses only as a body, without consciousness and without spirit form. Thus, only an impulse and instinctual growth and life process takes place. And will the earthly scientist one day, who are no longer all too far away, be so far that everything in the relationship mentioned functions perfectly, then this will have incisive consequences for the Earth humans. The whole thing, together with genetic engineering, will lead to all processes from conception to birth being scientifically monitored, so that physical and organic deformities, common diseases, and hereditary diseases, as well as damage to consciousness of all kinds, can be recognized and eliminated in the womb of the offspring. Every disease and disturbance is immediately recognized and treated, whereby only completely normal, healthy, and strong offspring will be born, which fully complies with the law of creation that every human being should be unharmed from any suffering, etc., at birth. And this development cannot prevent all stupid criers against genetic engineering and embryonic stem cell technology. In fact, these fools, who must be called, as you say, lunatics, cannot stop the whole development. But by their irresponsible actions, they can only inhibit progress for a certain time, thus ensuring that people will have to endure much suffering and pain for a long time to come. Something that could be avoided if progress were given the necessary space that the stupid and irresponsible, the obstacles to progress, are obstructing. In embryonic stem cell and genetic engineering, nothing is left to uncertain fate because everything is precisely controlled and consciously and safely controlled. The male germ cells created from embryonic stem cells, the sperm, as well as the female ova, do not differ from natural sperm and ova. In fact, they are as good, healthy, and strong as similar normal ones, from which they are also indistinguishable. Through stem cell and genetic engineering, it is also possible that offspring can be conceived without parents, which will continue to be the case in the distant future if the need so requires. Embryonic stem cell technology, together with genetic engineering, also enables the terrestrial human being in the distant future to carry out a healing or replacement of diseased organs, which will then be called therapeutic cloning. For this purpose, endogenous stem cells are produced by cloning by introducing an endogenous egg nucleus into a pitted egg cell, thus initiating the actual cloning procedure. The egg cell is made to believe it has been fertilized by an electrical voltage impulse, which then begins to divide, and an embryo is created. All cells that form after this procedure carry the body's own origin code, that is to say, the one that was inserted by the cell nucleus. This means that the body does not reject them. Stem cells with the body's own genetic code can then be obtained from this embryo. With this, every tissue and every other organ of the human body can be cultivated. Even the dead tissue of the heart can be replaced by the stem cells of the cloned embryo, for example, after a heart attack. This is because the stem cells of the cloned embryo carry the body's own hereditary molecule within them and thus outwit the immune system. This is in contrast to transplantations with foreign hereditary molecules, which is why only lifelong medication can prevent the rejection of foreign transplanted organs.
Thank you. Your explanation is more than I expected. You know, my old doctor and friend, Professor Dr. Gross, asked me if I could ask you about these things, because he deals with some colleagues all over the world with the concerns of genetic engineering and the whole thing. That is why I asked you about it via Henoch's path. But now I do not just want to go over your head and ask you if I can give him your full explanation.
Nothing stands in the way of that, because the beginnings of all the things mentioned have already surfaced with the earthly scientists. And to these belong also some friends of your medical friend, as I know, because I dealt with them informatively when you already explained something to me concerning them earlier. Besides, the course of things already going on is unstoppable, so I do not violate any directives. The earthly scientists, as well as your friends' friends, will in 10 to 15 years at the latest gain the same insights themselves that I have told you.
Thank you, my friend. Then I have another question from my friend about multiple sclerosis, which we have talked about several times before, where you explained that this disease causes extensive destruction of the nerve cells. I said the same to Dr. Gross, and he asked if you could explain more about it.
After that, you asked me some time ago why I asked Ptah for permission to give an answer. In this particular case, I may do so without violating the directives. That is because we know through a look into the future that we will not interfere with the earthly medical development with a corresponding analogy, because the physicians are already on the way to fathoming the facts of the disease, whereby they will make the first very valuable discoveries in about 13 years. If, however, I am to make another explanation, then I must be somewhat more detailed, although I must not disclose too many facts, as Ptah ordered me to do. Well then, multiple sclerosis is a disease that causes damage to structural tissue in certain areas of the brain and leads to the loss of functions in these areas. The disease begins with the destruction and perishing of the myelin sheaths. This is the protective and conductive substance that surrounds the nerve fibers, and which is also responsible for the fact that the electrical impulses generated by the brain reach the muscles at very high speed from the brain even into the most distant muscle fibers of the body. The destruction of the protective layer slowly destroys the actual nerve cells, also known as neurons. It can also be said that in relation to multiple sclerosis, T lymphocytes penetrate the brain and trigger the sequence of destructive processes. The destructive event results from the fact that the T lymphocytes carry large amounts of oxygen radicals, which is secreted during the attack and released onto the myelin. The oxygen radicals then act in such a way that they break open and penetrate the myelin sheath. This process then virtually oxidizes the molecules present, creating a very specific and major degradation product in the spinal fluid called oxidation cholesterol. The intensity of the attack on myelin also plays an important role, because the greater the intensity, the greater the concentration of oxidized cholesterol. This also penetrates into the microglia structural cells, whereby the fatty substance that penetrates into the cell nuclei stimulates a very specific enzyme, which I am not allowed to name at the moment, but which, it may be said, has a certain control function. When this control function is set in motion, the microglia cells are awakened from their resting state and become active, and indeed in such a wise that they get out of control and move away from their ancestral place and penetrate between the actual nerve cells. On the way, they cause great harm and destroy all the nerve cells that get in their way. This in turn leads to scarring, which becomes noticeable as a disease spurt. I am not allowed to explain more.
The certain enzyme, which you are not allowed to name, will be discovered in the near future. And what reason does it then have that you are not allowed to name it?
The enzyme will certainly be found, just as the connections will be discovered. I am therefore not allowed to describe the enzyme in more detail, because it would be an unauthorized interference in the development of terrestrial medicine and would therefore violate our directives. This is because knowledge of the exact connections and knowledge of the enzyme would make medical progress that is not yet bearable. This is because by recognizing that by preventing the enzyme, effective drugs can be created against the destructive microglial cells as they move into the nerve cells. But this would be an irresponsible intervention in the development of the earthly sciences of medicine, pharmacology, etc., which is forbidden by our directives, because the terrestrial human beings must follow their own path of development and must not attain knowledge that does not yet correspond to their consciousness-based and scientific development.
I see. Thank you. But then again, a question of my friend. If you may answer it for me, Edward, as my real first name, my friend Professor Dr. Gross is also called, asked if you could name a natural remedy that reduces radiation damage. He meant especially radiation damage of a medical nature.
I can give a brief explanation without violating our directives. Yes. There is a natural remedy which is said to have a certain radiation protection, but which at the same time has a certain effect against the growth of certain cancer tumors and may even prevent cancer. That is probably the concern of your friend, if I am not mistaken.
Exactly. Only I did not want to say it so openly.
That is what I thought. Well, I will deal with it, because what I have to explain does not point to an ultimate method in earthly medicine, but only to a means that can be used usefully under certain conditions. It is a natural substance called curcumin, which is extracted from a genus of tropical perennial plants, a turmeric, which belongs to the family Zingiberaceae and is called curcuma for short. The rootstock of the herbaceous plant contains essential oils as well as yellow dyes, such as curcumin, which have a choleretic and cholekinetic effect and can also be used in the aforementioned way.
Thank you. Then I have a question about the Chinese, who always claim that their whole culture originated from their own people. But Svath once told me that this is not the truth. You told me the same thing, but neither you nor Svath went into it. Both of you have only explained that Chinese culture also contains foreign influences.
That is of correctness. More than 25,000 years ago, the actual ancestors of the Chinese were immigrants from an area beyond your galaxy, which is why the term beyond the sun was used, meaning the galactic central sun in which the galactic black hole moves. The real human beings in China lived more than 2 million years ago. After the immigration of foreigners from beyond the Milky Way, the much later Earth-born natives who lived in the areas where today's China is died out over time. They died as a result of an incurable hereditary disease that spread as they mixed sexually with the new immigrants from beyond the sun. All this knowledge, however, as well as the knowledge of space technology and many other things, was lost, as was the knowledge of the original origins of the immigrants. The immigrants from beyond the sun, that is to say, the actual forefathers of today's Chinese people, already took over many cultural values of the natives from the natives alone, who inhabited the Chinese areas and had created certain small cultures. Later, another great cultural change took place in the Bronze Age, namely when immigrants from the areas of present-day Europe made the long journey to China and actually reached this country on foot as well as on carts and horses. They found their way to China through a group of adventurers, whose 42 men and women, 11 of whom survived and were on the road for 8 years. On their adventure journey, they reached China, from where they returned to Europe. There they told their peoples about the peaceful, slant-eyed people in the faraway land, where it was possible to live very good and well, and where there was enough land as well as large desert areas. And since there was great need in various areas of Europe, which had spread far into today's Ukraine, many tribes got together and made their way to the distant land, which they reached after about 3 years. The way was very dangerous, full of privations, led through deserts, steppes, and dangerous mountains, which often led to serious accidents and hardships, and also cost many human beings their lives. Nevertheless, China was reached, where the new immigrants mingled with the now local people and the distant descendants of those from beyond the sun, also sexually, and lived peacefully together with them. Thus again there were cultural changes, also in relation to the belief of the gods, because the immigrants coming from the areas of Europe and Near East were sun worshippers, even if they belonged to different tribes, which had spread over very large areas in Europe and Near East. This belief in sun worship was then adopted by the Chinese, the distant descendants from the areas beyond the Milky Way, along with other religions. Much later, the religions of Taoism and Confucianism were born. From the Han period 206 BC to 220 AD, Mahayana Buddhism made its entrance. Unfortunately, however, it happened again that over time the hereditary disease, which had already spread earlier, could spread, this time also affecting certain parts of those whose ancestors came from beyond the sun. The two human species died suddenly in large numbers and were partly buried together.
Interesting. I did not know that. Thank you for your explanation. Well, there are always questions about the flying discs that were secretly constructed in Germany before the Second World War and also during the war. I could observe flight attempts of such discs together with Svath during the war still before the middle of the 40s over Germany, whereby he explained to me some. Ptah also spoke of it. It was on the Great Journey that the flight tests sometimes brought very valuable results, and flights were carried out up to altitudes of around 12,500 meters. The engines were first explosion engines and later jet engines. In 1941, Svath and Ptah said, the planning had been completed, and the construction of the flying discs had been tackled. Look here, in this contact report the following is written, which Ptah explained.
Now, however, claims are being made again and again which, according to what Svath and Ptah have explained, have no basis whatsoever, because most of it is based only on wild fantasies and speculations, which probably serves to make a profit. For example, the crazy story that the Germans flew to Mars with their flying discs. Can you say something more about this?
Some things are known to me, which is why I can say that the disc aircraft of that time, which were already planned very early, that is to say from the 20s onwards, and later constructed, were developments that were considered miracle aircraft. This was because they were so-called single-wing aircraft. However, these flying discs or single-wing aircraft were nothing more than airplanes, even if they were of a completely different type than the normal wing aircraft. So they were not extraterrestrial or esoteric marvels, in which alleged extraterrestrials or people of other dimensions, etc., participated, as has been claimed to be, for some time, by lying and deceitful profit-obsessed ones, as well as by self-proclaimed false experts, contact persons, esotericists, and parapsychologists, by those who want to be great, by self-obsessed people, and by patients afflicted with inferiority complexes. The truth concerning the flying discs is simple and lies beyond all delusions, fantasies, and all erroneous assertions and stupid ideas. The fact is that not only in Germany since the 20s there have been projects concerning the planning and development of flying discs, but also in Russia, England, and America. At the same time, America, Germany, England, and Russia were already planning to conquer the moon and the entire solar system with regard to aircraft suitable for space travel. Everything happened, however, under strictest secrecy, as I already said. When at the end of the war, the Americans and Englishmen illegally appropriated large parts of the German flying disc technology, which was already very advanced, the war winners had won. So it became just 1 year later, when the British and the Americans tested the captured technology together in Canada, as well as the Americans also in their own country, and with success. Since then, progress has not stopped, so that many different types of flying discs have been developed, which can be seen again and again when they are on test or spy flights. Ultimately, all this technology should serve to monitor the entire Earth, as should be the case with humans themselves, who should be subjected to total surveillance by implanted control chips. Such plans already exist in secret, whereby in Europe the European Union, which is already on its way, will be the authoritative dictatorship. The flying disc technology, however, when I want to come back to it, is also integrated into space technology, because for a long time there have been efforts to construct the flying discs in such a form that they can be used to travel around space and reach other planets, which are Earth-like in shape and inseminated. These newly developed flying discs have been leading to UFO sightings all over the world for quite some time now, and then it has been deliberately mistakenly claimed by a wide variety of sources that these are aircraft of extraterrestrial origin. There are many irresponsible freeloaders who make big deals and immense profits with the UFO believers because they are cheated and financially exploited by the liars, cheaters and swindlers as well as charlatans. Thus, many also appear who knowingly lie and fraudulently claim that they are in direct or telepathic contact with extraterrestrials, whereby their whole swindle is believed by the unsuspecting. On the other hand, your truthful contacts with us are vehemently denied by know-it-alls and opponents, enviés, autocrats, image addicts, sectarians, etc., and you are portrayed as a liar and a fraud, despite all the irrefutable evidence you can produce. Evidence that no alleged contact person can produce. But all this will intensify in the time to come, with the UFO believers running after all the contact swindlers without hesitation, courting them and going astray. Increasingly, many will claim through lies and deceit that they are in personal or telepathic contact with Simya-se, with Ptah, with me, or with others of our races, as well as with higher spirit forms of our planes in personal or telepathic as well as channeling contact. But everything will only be lies, deceit and dizziness, because no human being on the earth apart from you will be able to come into any kind of contact with us, just as we will only be able to come into contact with you, for which you know the reasons. Nevertheless, in the next few years, a contactee psychosis will spread across the earth, as well as a true extraterrestrial delusion and a kidnapping delusion by extraterrestrials will appear in relation to belief in all imaginable and unimaginable extraterrestrials. Thereby, through the extraterrestrial fairy tale, an enormous financial business will come about that will far exceed the previous one and will be coupled with esotericism and parapsychology. This will benefit the secret plans of the countries which are doing their mischief with the flying discs, which is why they are very diligent in their machinations, which they then ascribe to aliens through their information channels. For example, certain machinations with crop circles, animal massacres and alleged abductions and harm, etc. by alleged aliens, in which all sorts of pretenses are made through hypnosis and even foreign bodies are implanted in the abducted, etc. Thus, all possible and impossible aliens are invented, so that the secret plans and machinations can be carried out unchallenged, whereby, however, also the fear of aliens is stirred up and driven up. So it is a fact that since 1945, when the plans of the air disc technology fell into the hands of the Americans, Russians and English, with few exceptions, the whole earthly humankind is lied to and deceived, and for this every means is justified, also alleged activities of extraterrestrials. And all those fools, irresponsible, criminals, deceivers, liars and swindlers, etc., in matters of alleged contacts with extraterrestrials, spirits, dead and higher beings are co-responsible for the fact that the secret machinations can be promoted in relation to the flying discs, because with their lies and deceits, they promote everything still. So they help those who have been lying to and cheating on humankind since 1945, who can secretly make enormous technical achievements on the flying discs and realize their secret projects in order to control and subjugate all of humankind and the planet to totality. And all this is financed with huge sums of money stolen from people with unjust tax money. But back to the flying discs in Nazi Germany. The single-winged flying discs of all kinds of the Nazi era were as purely of earthly origin as they still are today, since they are technically very much further developed and can often be observed. In fact, however, they are nothing more than terrestrial airplanes. In Nazi Germany, too, the planning and construction of flying discs was also a strictly secret military project, but under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. These projects involved many distinguished scientists, such as a certain Beluzzo, a Mithe, an Epp, and a Schriever, to name but a few. At that time, the technology of the single-wing flying discs was a completely new technology, which had very futuristic forms and was preserved until today. Nevertheless, this whole development was, and is, based on the terrestrial normal aeronautical technology, so that no extraterrestrial or other dimensioned flying technique or propulsion technology comes into effect. So neither anti-gravitational drives played a role or could be used, nor any converter devices, which allegedly originated from extraterrestrials or other dimensions, because in fact, they are all only wild and nonsensical, imaginative, or quite consciously lying and fraudulent claims. The same applies to claims that the Germans flew to Mars or even to distant galaxies with their flying discs. Truthfully, first the engines were explosion engines and later radiation and rocket engines, which in turn were improved later by air combustion catalytic converters. The aim was to suck the air from the wing of the flying disc, to liquefy it quickly by cooling it down, after which it was burned catalytically and thus served as propulsion energy, which was ejected by rotating nozzles on the outer ring of the flying disc in a fogging manner, whereby the missile was seen only blurred.
This should now actually clear up the story. Then I have a question about the so-called vitamin popes, who do business for millions with vitamins, multivitamins, trace elements, and minerals, and claim that their products prevent or cure cancer. What can I say about that?
It is a pure and infamous business and profit-making of irresponsible elements who, through conscious lies and beautification, exploit the stupidity of their believers to make immense financial profits. The fact is that the products they advertise cannot prevent or cure any form of cancer, because all cancers require different prevention and healing conditions. Otherwise to be said, that in terms of maintaining and strengthening the immune system, as well as the good and proper functioning of the body organs, separate intake of vitamin, mineral, and trace element products is justified. In truth, such allegations are deliberately based on lies and fraud and serve only the purpose of profit and image seeking. Further, however, these lies and deceptions of irresponsible would-be bigwigs also serve to ruin the drug industry, which is based on very good orthodox medical knowledge, and without which countless people would have to live or die in agony. There is nothing wrong with demonstrably good and useful natural healing methods, but what the greedy for profit do with their vitamin, mineral, and trace element products and the lies and deceptions associated with them has nothing to do with any natural healing methods, but with lies and deception, as I said, which only stupid and unneeded fall victim to. And this evil is getting more and more prevalent because more and more irresponsible chase after financial wealth and exploit the stupid and naive with lies, fraud, and deception.
But the stupid and naive cannot be taught, because their intelligence is not sufficient to grasp the information. It is this lack of intelligence that makes them delude themselves that these products for cancer prevention and cure would actually help them or would have helped them, even though other factors have really brought about success.
This is of correctness. The truth can hardly be expressed more clearly.
Good. Svath once talked about nanotechnology and nanoparticles and ultra-nanoparticles, which are said to be so tiny and tinier than tiny that they themselves are absorbed by bacteria, which can then perish. However, these tiny and super small or ultra-small particles are said to be life-threatening for all life forms if they are inhaled and cause cell damage in the brain and other organs, which then leads to death. Nevertheless, according to him, the time will come in the near future when earthly scientists will begin to experiment with nanoparticles. What can result from this?
We have talked about nanotechnology before, but not about nanoparticles and ultra-nanoparticles. These will soon be in everyone's mouths among earthly scientists and will be treated experimentally in the laboratories. These are tiny and minute carbon molecules. If these are breathed in, no matter what form of life they are, from the most super tiny to the most gigantic, the particles enter the lungs and brain, as well as other organs, causing cell damage or destruction, leading to rapid death in some life forms and death in others sooner or later. Spraying on plants can also cause lasting damage or death. And it must also be said that nanoparticles and ultra-nanoparticles can be released or carried in food through improper, careless handling or intentionally by criminal private, state, military, sectarian, and terrorist elements, which may endanger many millions of lives. Carbon nanoparticles can be artificially produced in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, and can be used with great precautions to be very valuable. For example, for medicine and cosmetics, for electronics, electrics and energy technology, as well as for plant treatments, pest control, and for protective treatments for materials of all kinds, etc. If nanotechnology and nanoparticles as well as ultra-nanoparticles are handled improperly, a great deal of harm can result, while if they are used properly and responsibly, a great many advantages and benefits can be gained for earthly humankind.
The whole thing can be just as unpleasant as what you said some time ago regarding the fact that nitrogen, etc., destroys the oxygen in the water and in the soil. The fertilizers used in all agriculture and horticulture, as well as by private individuals for their gardens and lawns, etc. In this regard, Ava asked a professor at the University of Zurich how long it would take for our land to be oxygenated and free of all the artificial fertilizers irresponsibly introduced into the soil by former farmers. Without all kinds of artificial fertilizers and nitrogen being constantly spread on the land, nothing has grown. The soil is completely exhausted and has become so oxygen depleted that hardly any grass grows. The explanation Eva received from a professor at the university was that we would have to reckon with 52 years before the land had recovered and regenerated.
You have told me about that. With regard to the lack of oxygen that affects the lands of farmers and gardeners, it must be said that this is really a very serious factor that should be remedied by banning the application of artificial fertilizers and returning the soil and land to its natural state. If this does not happen, the time will come in the distant future when the land and the soil will become completely infertile and can still be stimulated to produce only by artificial fertilizers. This also applies to waters, brooks, rivers, streams, lakes, and oceans in which artificial fertilizers, mainly nitrogen, rapidly develop enormous algae carpets which deprive the waters of all oxygen and cause them to die.
Yes, that is exactly what you said. Then another question from my friend Dr. Gross. He asks whether you know where syphilis comes from, whether it has always existed in Europe or whether it was introduced. And since you, as a doctor, are also concerned with our earthly diseases, he said that you certainly knew.
I actually know about that. Syphilis, also known as hard-Shankshire, is a mutation disease that has developed in Europe, mainly in the port cities and large trading towns. At first, it was a severe and often fatal skin disease accompanied by whole body, open, bloody, and suppurating rashes. This skin disease was widespread all over the world, especially in rural areas, where there was a lack of hygiene at all ends. This lack of hygiene affected all aspects of life: the clothing and personal hygiene, the crockery, the food preparation, the living quarters and sleeping areas, the sexual practices, as well as the treatment of clothing fabrics, the dyeing of which was carried out with the use of human and animal urine, etc. All factors which promoted diseases, as well as the bad skin disease. In Europe, seafarers, adventurers, and commercial travelers carried this skin disease to all port cities and trading towns, where hygiene was much better than in any rural place. Bodies and clothes were kept clean, as were living and sleeping accommodations and crockery. Sexual practices were also maintained in much more hygienic form, and fabrics were dyed not with urine, but with vegetable and other natural dyes. As a result, the imported bacteria no longer found a breeding ground in the uncleanliness of humans, so they could no longer survive on their skin. Thus cleanliness drove the bacteria into other realms, namely into the sex organs, where they found a suitable habitat for them and mutated into dangerous and deadly syphilis, which could very quickly be transmitted from one person to another only by direct sexual acts of all kinds. In contrast to the bad skin disease, which could be transmitted by direct contact, by drinking from a bacterial vessel, by touching clothes, objects, etc., syphilis originated in ancient Greece and was spread from there throughout Europe. Later, in 1494, Christopher Columbus and his seafarers brought the disease to America, where the natives, who at that time also suffered from rash skin disease, were infested with it and from then on had two evils for a long time, which brought them death.
Since the Vikings were the first to discover America before Columbus and after the Chinese, they could have brought syphilis to the Indians.
But that was not the case. Besides, the Vikings were not the first to discover America from another continent. In fact, under the command of Leif the Happy, the Vikings were only the first Europeans to discover America. A long time before the Vikings, the ancient Chinese already sailed to America on various occasions, but they did not leave any great things behind, but traded with some Indian tribes.
Then a question about addiction. Can you tell me where an addiction can arise in humans or animals and whether it is hereditary?
Addictions of all kinds are genetically inheritable, but not every addiction in a progeny must become acute if the person acts against the addiction. Not only a single gene is decisive, but also a whole range of genes that jointly determine heredity. All addictive substances can lead to heredity, for example, alcohol in any form, nicotine in any form, that is to say, by inhaling smoke, drinking, or chewing, then also artificial and natural drugs, artificial and natural gases as well as artificial and natural fragrances, etc. Sugar, cocoa, herbs, and all kinds of substances from plants, bushes, trees, fruits, and vegetables can also be mentioned as addictive substances and hereditary factors. Certain rocks and metals can also cause addictions and their heredity. Many of the addictive substances exert a direct influence on the brain, which then often releases endorphins, such as alcohol, which provoke a certain individual sense of well-being. The actual addiction arises in the addiction center, which we call Tanggulan Sarod, which means as much as dependency center.
Then I would like to come back to the substance curcumin, which can also be used against the growth of cancer tumors. Are there other plants and plant substances that are useful in this respect? Can you tell me about another plant or active ingredient, perhaps something that is freely available to everyone?
There are still a lot of plants and plant substances, but I do not want to list them in larger numbers. One active ingredient should be mentioned. However, the active ingredient that will in future be called polyphenol EGCG, which is easily available and can be supplied to the body, especially through the consumption of green tea.
Ah, very simple green tea?
That is of correctness.
And quantitatively, how much must be drunk there?
2 to 3 deciliters a day are enough. As with curcumin, that has to be said. It is not a remedy that heals existing cancer tumors comprehensively, but only has a positive effect, and to a certain extent can also affect the development and growth of certain tumors. In particular, certain cancer cells excessively produce so-called laminin receptors on their surface, to which the polyphenol EGCG binds and acts into the cancer cell. This triggers an ongoing series of growth-inhibiting reactions and inhibits the growth of existing cancer tumors, as well as the formation of metastases. Laminin receptors are not only decisive in the form that the polyphenol EGCG can dock to them, because unfortunately the BSE prions, of which we have already spoken on several occasions, also do so.
Exactly, mad cow disease. But while we are at it, you recently mentioned something about AIDS, namely that there is several times less risk of AIDS in men if foreskin circumcision is given. But you did not go further than that.
Yes, that is right. Men who are circumcised on the foreskin have a much lower risk of AIDS than uncircumcised men. The reason for this is, in the foreskin there are large quantities of cell types that are very susceptible to the HIV virus, and can therefore easily be infected. Through the trimming, the cell types find only a very bad culture medium, and thus only a bad location, provided, of course, that the man takes care of the necessity of daily thorough cleaning. If this happens, the risk of HIV infection is reduced by about 5 times. However, this does not mean that unprotected sexual practices can be practiced, because HIV positivity is always associated with the risk of infection.
Being circumcised does not mean immunity, but only a minimal risk of infection. Circumcision does not protect genital herpes, gonorrhea, syphilis, or other venereal diseases. However, it can be very useful where a lack of penis hygiene leads to all kinds of penile diseases, fungal infections, eczema, rot, etc. This was the order of the day in southern Arabia, especially at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, which is why he decreed the order of circumcision and the associated daily cleansing. He took over circumcision from the old Jews, who for the same reason had the same principle as a rule, tracing it back to Moses, who introduced the law of circumcision, because already then the genital impurity gave rise to enormous sexually transmitted diseases and degenerations. Removal of pubic hair was also introduced for the same reason, also for women. To my knowledge, however, these facts are no longer known, or they are deliberately concealed for whatever reason. As far as I know, the real justification was never recorded in writing, but declared to be God's demand, because the relevant laws were only followed because they were allegedly ordered by a god. Either way, however, the relevant laws have taken hold and brought physical cleanliness to the Jewish and Arab tribes and peoples, and fortunately, everything has survived to this day. Yes, today it is even the case that even many Christians, as well as people of no religion and other faiths, as Muslims get rid of their pubic hair, and therefore go about more cleanly than many others who are not so fond of general body hygiene.
That is of correctness.
A question: what is your situation regarding circumcision? And here on the earth, certain religions and peoples even circumcise women, but they lose their sexual power and suffer tremendous torments.
The circumcision of women corresponds to an outrageous Ausartung, a getting very badly out of control of the good human nature, which finds no justification whatsoever, and which is aimed exclusively at the benefit of the man. Just as the constriction of the female shame by sewing it up to a certain extent, as unfortunately is also practiced. The whole thing is so reprehensible that anyone who practices such practices on women should be severely punished. What you ask about us? No, our peoples do not have foreskin circumcisions because general body hygiene, and with it, genital hygiene, is the most important daily body treatment. Consequently, men do not require circumcision of the foreskin. Cleanliness in the genital area is one of our most urgent body care needs, which is why we have not known any genital diseases for thousands of years.
How nice it would be if this were also the case here on the earth.
Unfortunately, this will not be the case for a long time yet, because the future speaks of the opposite, which will be attributed in particular to the prevalence of legalized prostitution, which in the future will experience an Ausartung, a getting very badly out of control of the good human nature, that will take on worse forms than it did at the time of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Which, once again, I do not think can be changed. But tell me, what do you think about placebos? In my opinion, such sham drugs stimulate certain brain regions that function in such a manner that a non-existent reaction is felt. This leads to pain relief or even healing. But a placebo does not necessarily have to be a sham drug, because it can also be a sectarian, religious, or other faith that is associated with pain relief or healing. The reaction in the brain is thus, as I simply want to say, triggered in any case by the belief in the placebo, no matter whether it is a real sham drug or any belief in a religion, sect or philosophy, any saint, any religious object, any levitated water, any holy juice, any laying on of hands by helpless charlatans and deceivers, etc., or by dreams, visions or useless promising words and movements, etc., etc. No matter whether it is about a real sham drug or about any belief in a religion, about the laying on of hands by helpless charlatans and deceivers, etc., or about dreams, visions or useless promising words and movements, etc. The whole thing can ultimately be compared to the fact that belief releases forces of consciousness in such a strong and uncontrolled form that spontaneous self-immolations can be caused, that the lame can suddenly walk again, the deaf can hear, the dumb can speak, and the blind can see again. Sfath has already taught me this, and I have also gained the same insights from Nakademion's and Henoch's memory banks.
I have nothing to add to your explanations, because my knowledge is the same as yours.
Also good. But how about this? It is always said that laughter not only makes you happy, but that it should also be healthy. That it makes you happy is clear to me, but what is the connection with health?
Laughter actually promotes happiness, but also happiness and health, the latter being promoted by stimulating and strengthening the immune system. This refers only to spontaneous and real laughter, not to artificial laughter. Even a true inner amusement has a positive stimulating effect on the immune system. A real spontaneous laughter also produces a general physical sense of well-being, which also expands into a psychological sense of well-being, because thoughts and feelings are positively influenced and happily stimulated by a spontaneous laugh.
Interesting. As you know, I have suffered from severe tinnitus since my collapse on the 4th of November 1982, which is why I have to take medication every day. But this does not make the suffering disappear, but only reduces it somewhat. I fight most of it with my own behavioral therapy, by inserting a post-hypnotic command into my subconscious mind, to imagine the noises in my ears simply being ignored by my consciousness and subconscious mind. I do the same with the phantom pain in my left upper arm, where pain occurs in the missing hand. Sometimes, however, the ringing in my ears becomes so loud that despite everything, I can only hear the real external sounds and voices with difficulty, just as the phantom pains sometimes become so violent that I could go up the walls. In such times, sometimes it is a few minutes, but then it can be hours or 2 or 3 days, simply overflowing everything, making it difficult to keep control. This is especially so in relation to phantom pain, because I do not take medication against it, but only control it by thinking away from it. In this respect, I think that it should be possible for everyone to do the same with pain, etc., because there is a similar effect to a placebo, but in this case, everything is consciously controlled. What do you think? And as far as tinnitus is concerned, it is true, as you once said, that many psychological effects are to blame for this evil, at least for many people. So there are also psychosomatic forms of tinnitus.
That is of correctness, my friend. With you, however, I have to say that from my point of view there is no psychosomatic factor, because your suffering is based on a rotary vertigo, which is called Meniere's disease. The origin lies in your health collapse on the 4th of November 1982, in which you also suffered head trauma and cerebral brain damage. In spite of your post-hypnotic suggestive self-therapy, it is not possible for you to be able to cope with the evil without any significant medication, because the damage is too profound. You are only able to bring a certain part under control by your self-suggestive disregard of the complaints, while another part has to be calmed by the medication. Consequently, still a remainder of the suffering remains perceptible. And with regard to the fact that such complaints can be treated by all people to a certain extent by thinking away, this corresponds to correctness. But this requires, as you yourself know from your own experience, that both the necessary will as well as the necessary control must be applied, in addition to the fact that no sniveling may be given place.
Then I would like to ask again a question concerning the green monkeys, an African species of monkey from which the AIDS epidemic started in principle, and was also transferred to other species of monkeys and to humans. I would like to address the fact that our doctors and medical scientists always claim that viruses and bacteria that infect animals, fish, beetles, spiders, reptiles, birds, insects, etc., or are infested by and cause these diseases or are immune to them, cannot spread to humans. Svath told me in my youth, however, when he once spoke of serious epidemics to come in the future, that earthly medical science was under a serious error with the assumption that animal bacteria and viruses could not or would not jump over the species barrier, because the opposite was the case.
This is also of correctness, because in fact, there are no bacterial genera and subspecies, as well as no viruses, which live on or in other life forms than humans, which could not break through the species barrier and jump over to other life forms, and thus also to humans. Especially in the future, this fact will lead to many new epidemics in the terrestrial human being, whereby then, unfortunately, also worldwide epidemics will be to be feared. In addition to this, there is also the danger of the introduction of diseases and epidemics from the world space in the near future, when materials from other planets, as well as from other moons, from asteroids and comets, and from clouds of matter are collected captured, and brought to the earth. But now, my friend, it is time for me to go, because I still have a lot of work to do. Of course, you still have a lot of questions which you will always have, but today it is not enough anymore to answer more. When soon Ptah will be your contact person again, he will be available for all your questions. For my part, I have to turn to other things from now on, which is why I can only visit you very rarely. So I wish you can stay well and to be able to do justice to your task in a comprehensive manner, without great difficulties appearing. Soon you will have the worst time behind you, because if your actual adversary, your wife, leaves your immediate sphere because she will disgracefully remove herself, then there will be a great upswing. Unfortunately, her presence was unavoidable, because only then could everything flourish, because only then did the resistance forces in the group members grow in such a manner that she began to fight and finally led everything to success. So be of good cheer, because even if it still takes a few years until their departure, it will be soon. Also, be assured that I will always visit you when the opportunity presents itself. But now, dear friend, farewell and goodbye.
What should I say about that? Thank you very much for everything. You, too, have become a very dear friend to me, and it will certainly be the case that I will often be with you in my thoughts. But I still want to ask you if I can contact you via Ptah or via someone else. If any things appear that fall into your sphere, like, for example, the rules of conduct concerning the group as well as the statutes, the duties and other tasks that fall within your realm of competence, or is Ptah then responsible for it?
My responsibility will remain, while Ptah will serve as my replacement. He can also decide certain matters. However, if there are questions, etc., in which I alone am experienced, then I have to decide alone or together with Ptah. But be assured that I am always available for you.
Thank you.
Then it is really time for me now. Farewell, my friend.